All right, if you're the passenger in a car that gets pulled over, can the officer order you out of the vehicle during that traffic stop, and do you have to comply? In this video, we're going to address that issue. And so I want to welcome you back if you've watched some of my videos before. If you don't know who I am, my name is Jamahl Kersey. I am a criminal defense attorney. I've been practicing law for over 15 years. And on this channel, we're breaking down legal concepts so you're in the know. All right, it's really important to know your rights when it comes to interactions with the police, because you want to be able to call them out and check them when they're doing something wrong. But you also want to know if they're doing something right. You don't want to believe that they're violating your rights and, you know, make a problem out of something that really isn't an issue, right? And so one of those things has to do with getting pulled over and being ordered out of the vehicle. This is a Fourth Amendment issue. And again, the Fourth Amendment protects us from unreasonable searches and seizures, and generally speaking, requires a warrant for searches. But interestingly enough, the Fourth Amendment doesn't mention specifically people getting pulled over, and it certainly doesn't mention officers ordering people out of the vehicle. So the Supreme Court over time has applied its analysis of the Fourth Amendment to different factual scenarios, and that's how we have the development of new case law and precedent. So let's get into Maryland versus Wilson so we can get the answer to our question. So Maryland versus Wilson is the Supreme Court case that was on point. This case was from 1997, and in it, the cop had observed a vehicle that was traveling down the highway. It was doing about 9 miles an hour over the speed limit. It also had an issue with an expired tag, so the cop pulled the car over, right? So eventually the cop pulls over. The officer approaches. There's a driver and 2 passengers in the vehicle. Now, as the officer is approaching, he sees the passenger. They're kind of like turning around. They're ducking down. They pop back up. They turn back around. They look at the officer. They're, ducking down. And so, naturally that's going to cause some concern for the officer. But as he's walking up towards the vehicle, the driver gets out of the vehicle. So he gets out of the vehicle and he's walking and meeting the officer halfway. The officer noted that he appeared to be nervous. He was actually trembling, and he had a Connecticut driver's license. So we're in Baltimore, Maryland. He has a Connecticut license, hands the officer the license. He lets the officer know that it's a rental vehicle. And so the cop is like, okay, go back in the car, get your rental paperwork. Let's check it out and make sure everything is okay. So the driver gets back in the car to look for the rental documents, and the officer notices that the front passenger is actually sweating. So he's sweating and looking nervous. So the officer naturally orders him out of the vehicle. He's like, get out of the car, right? As Wilson is getting out of the car, some crack falls to the ground, right? And so the officer observes what it is, ends up arresting Wilson for possession with intent to distribute crack cocaine. He ends up getting charged with that same offense. And interestingly enough, his lawyer ends up filing a motion to suppress. So he filed a motion to have the crack thrown out, because even though he obviously had crack on his person, the argument was that, hey, the officer had no basis in ordering you out of the vehicle. As you probably know by now, even if you are in violation of the law, right? If the officer is, if they conduct an illegal search or an illegal seizure, then anything that comes from that illegal search or seizure can end up being thrown out. And that's what happened in this case, because the circuit court actually ended up granting the motion. So they found, hey, it was unreasonable for the officer to order Wilson out of the vehicle. And so even though he had the crack on him, and even though it appears obviously that he had enough of it to indicate that it was with intent to distribute, they threw it out. So naturally, the prosecutors had issue with this decision, right? So they ended up appealing. It ended up going to the Court of Special Appeals of Maryland. And interestingly enough, that court upheld the lower court's decision to throw out the crack. The Court of Special Appeals found that Pennsylvania versus Mims does not apply to passengers, and so therefore the officer's actions were unreasonable. So the prosecution has lost twice at this point on this issue. So the motion had been granted. Obviously, they opposed that. Then they tried to appeal that decision to the Court of Special Appeals, and the Court of Special Appeals affirmed the lower court decision. So the prosecution wanted to continue to appeal, so they tried to go to the Court of Appeals of Maryland. The Court of Appeals of Maryland declined to review the case, and so it ended up going to the United States Supreme Court. And the United States Supreme Court now needed to resolve the issue of whether an officer could order a passenger versus a driver out of the vehicle during a routine traffic stop. And so the Supreme Court, similar to in Pennsylvania versus Mims, is analyzing the reasonableness of the government's invasion of personal security. So we end up again with this balancing act between public interest and the driver's individual liberty, right? And freedom from arbitrary and random interference by the police. And so remember, in Pennsylvania versus Mims, Mims had been pulled over for expired tags, and the officer said, I ordered him out of the vehicle because I order everyone out of the vehicle, right? The prosecution in that case, they admitted there was nothing that the officer could see that would suggest that Mims had just committed a crime or was about to commit a crime, or nothing to suggest that he was suspicious in any way. The officer had just said, hey, in the interest of my safety, I order everyone out of the vehicle. And so the Supreme Court had acknowledged that, hey, traffic stops can be a very dangerous thing for officers. A person can have a knife on them. A person can have a gun on them. They can use their vehicle as a weapon. So they acknowledge the inherently dangerous nature of traffic stops. But again, the inquiry didn't stop there. They then had to balance that with the intrusion on the driver's liberty. The court, in doing the balancing act between the officer's safety and the driver's liberty, or the intrusion on the liberty, found that that intrusion was minimal. They found it de minimis. And so in doing that balancing act, they put more importance on the officer's safety versus the minimal intrusion on a person's liberty in being ordered out of a vehicle. And so they found that an officer ordering a driver out of the vehicle during a traffic stop is not a violation of their Fourth Amendment rights. Wilson's position was like, yeah, that's all and good. We understand what Pennsylvania versus Mims says, but I wasn't the driver. I was the passenger, and so therefore this doesn't apply to me. And so the court had to do this same analysis, weighing the officer's safety interest versus the passenger's individual liberty interests. And they said, well, you know, the passenger probably has a stronger personal liberty argument than the driver, right? Because the driver, presumably, if they're getting pulled over, they've committed some sort of violation of the law, right? They were speeding or expired tags or what have you. The passenger is just a passenger, right? Who's done nothing wrong. And so, yes, the passenger has a stronger personal liberty argument than the driver. But again, when it comes back to weighing officers' safety versus the invasion on the passenger's liberty, the court sided with officer safety. Again, the Supreme Court acknowledged that traffic stops can be very dangerous for officers, and they said that danger is heightened when you have one or more passengers in the vehicle versus just the driver. So in the end, in the balancing act, they found that the officer's safety wins the day, and so ultimately, even a passenger can be ordered out of the vehicle lawfully during a traffic stop. So ultimately, if you are the passenger in a vehicle and you get pulled over by the police and the police order you out of the vehicle, you have to comply. You definitely don't want to physically resist. And if you feel like they've done something wrong, if you feel like they're violating your rights, it's best not to be confrontational on the street. It's best to make note of everything. If you are in a position where you can pull out your phone and record the interactions, then do so, and make sure you reach out to a defense attorney immediately to analyze the situation and figure out what your rights might be and what you can do about the situation. Well, I hope you learned something. If you got something out of this, show me some love, hit the like button, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on those notifications so you never miss a new video when it drops. As always, I want to thank you so much for watching, and until next time, peace.